He didn't yell. He didn't push back. He didn't even blink. A black belt martial artist, young, cocky, viral on social media, walked straight up to a royal guard and kicked him, hard, in front of hundreds. But Sergeant Owen Ryle, he didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't give him anything. The crowd fell silent. What happened in the next 8 seconds didn't just stun the square. It made the entire internet stop scrolling, because what they saw wasn't just discipline. It was something older, heavier, unshakable. And before you decide whether Ryle was brave, or foolish, or something else entirely, ask yourself, could you have stood still? Before we reveal what happened next, and why that moment was more than just a viral video, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's go back to the square, to the moment a royal guard was kicked and made everyone watch without saying a word. The sun hadn't yet burned through the gray haze when Sergeant Owen Ryle stood for his morning inspection. Buckingham Palace glinted softly behind him, its white stone facade still damp from the early mist. His boots, polished to an impossible shine, didn't move an inch, not as the quartermaster checked his brass buttons, not as the younger guards around him fidgeted and adjusted belts, not even as a pigeon landed near his foot and strutted defiantly around his ankle. Stillness was second nature to him. It wasn't an act. It was his bloodstream. Sergeant Owen Ryle was 46, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked carved from old stone and a face weathered not by age, but by war. His eyes didn't dart or blink much. They just watched, quietly. The kind of gaze that didn't invite questions, but seemed to already know the answers. He didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't flinch when tourists screamed in his ear, and didn't shift weight even when standing for hours on end. He had served in Afghanistan, 2 tours with the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, before transferring into ceremonial duty. For most, that transition meant peace. For Ryle, it was a different kind of war, a quieter one. There was something about standing still while the world tried to shake you that appealed to him. Maybe because he'd once spent 13 minutes pinned behind a burnt-out Husky vehicle while insurgents fired blindly across open terrain. Maybe because he'd watched men break under noise, under heat, under pressure, and learned that sometimes the stillest man is the one who saves everyone else. Now, in the red tunic and bearskin, he stood outside the palace archway every third day. Not for glory, not for tourists, for something deeper. He didn't seek recognition. In fact, he avoided it. When the Household Division offered him a sergeant speaking role for a documentary on military tradition, he declined with a single sentence. The hat speaks enough. Among the younger guards, he was a quiet legend. They called him Stonewall behind his back, not with mockery, but with awe. One recruit swore he saw Ryle standing perfectly motionless as hail pelted the forecourt like gunfire. Another claimed he once watched Ryle blink just once in a full hour, but Ryle didn't care for stories. He cared for protocol. Each morning, before stepping into the courtyard, he would reach into the inside pocket of his red tunic. Tucked inside, next to his breast, was a small folded piece of lined paper, worn soft at the edges, his son's handwriting. The letter wasn't long. It had arrived months ago, just after Oliver, his only son, had started university in Manchester. They hadn't spoken much since. The boy was trying to find his place in the world. Ryle respected that. Still, he read the letter each time he went on duty. It said, "Dad, I don't always get why you do this, why you stand there and let people make fun of you, but I know you're proud, and I know you've always believed in things I didn't understand. I'm trying to. I hope that means something." He never responded, but he carried it anyway. That morning, as a tourist group gathered behind the barrier and began the usual swarm of selfies, shouts, and theatrical commentary, Ryle stepped into place beneath the northern arch. His SA-80 rifle rested diagonally across his chest, gripped with precision. His chin lifted slightly, his boots aligned with the cobblestone seam beneath him. A flashbulb went off nearby. A child imitated his posture in the background. Someone shouted, "Boo!" near his ear. Ryle didn't flinch. He never did. And yet, deep in the bone of every hour he stood, he knew something most didn't. He knew stillness isn't passive. Stillness is a choice, a resistance, a shield. And before the day was done, it would be tested harder than he ever expected. Because across the plaza, walking confidently toward the crowd with a camera crew in tow, was a young man with a black belt and something to prove. Jaden Locke wasn't the first young man to show up at Buckingham Palace looking for attention, but he might have been the loudest. 21 years old, black belt since 16, and recently crowned Europe's most watched street martial artist by a click-hungry blog, Jaden had built his brand off one thing: confrontation, specifically confronting stoic military guards around the world and trying to break their composure. He called it Discipline versus Disruption, a flashy series that racked up millions of views on social media. He'd done it in Athens, in Seoul, even in front of the Vatican, where he got escorted out by two very patient Swiss guards after miming a roundhouse near the gates. But London? London was next level. He arrived with 3 crew members, 2 handheld cameras, and a wireless mic clipped to his sleeveless hoodie. The hoodie bore his signature slogan across the back in neon font: "Let's see if you're really trained." Jaden wasn't malicious, just young, cocky, confident in a way that came not from life experience, but from the illusion of invincibility that sometimes wraps around youth like armor. He saw the guards not as people, but as symbols, props even, backdrops for his testing. And in his mind, he wasn't hurting anyone. He wasn't punching, just provoking, challenging the myth of the immovable man. "All right," he said into his lapel mic, voice low, swagger dialed high. "Let's see what the Queen's best are made of." His friend Matteo panned the camera wide to capture the guards across the forecourt. Dozens of tourists turned as the filming began. Some smiled, a few rolled their eyes. Jaden walked slowly toward the northern archway, toward Sergeant Owen Ryle. He didn't know Ryle's name, didn't care to. To him, the guard was just another uniform, another chance to go viral. He stopped a few feet in front of Ryle, eyes scanning him up and down. "Respect to the stance," Jaden said, nodding like a coach sizing up a fighter. "But let's see what's under the hat." He began the usual routine. First, low-level annoyance, exaggerated salutes, fake sneezes, wide-mouthed yawns. Ryle didn't move. Next came proximity. Jaden stepped in closer, circling slightly to the left, keeping his hands behind his back like he was studying a statue. The cameras kept rolling. Then came voice, loud claps, a burst of laughter, a few theatrical karate noises just inches from Ryle's shoulder. Still, nothing. The tourists around them started whispering. Some knew what Jaden was doing. Others were unsure. A mother near the fence pulled her child closer. Jaden glanced sideways at Matteo and grinned. "Watch this." He stepped back, just enough to get a clear angle. No warning, no build-up. A sudden, sharp side kick, fast, deliberate, and full of practiced power, snapped toward Ryle's right thigh. It wasn't meant to maim, but it wasn't soft either. The impact echoed across the stone. A gasp rippled through the square. Cameras froze mid-swipe. A flock of pigeons took flight. A tourist dropped her phone. Jaden's foot bounced off Ryle's leg like it had struck marble. Ryle didn't move. Not even a breath shifted in his posture. No blink, no flinch, no sign of pain or reaction. Jaden staggered back a half step, eyes wide now, not in fear, but confusion. His breathing hitched. "Whoa, okay." The guard simply stood there, unbothered, immovable. In the silence that followed, you could hear a paper program fluttering to the ground from someone's purse. And then, Ryle moved, just slightly. He shifted one boot a few millimeters to the side, not to retreat, not to brace, but as if drawing an invisible line in the courtyard, a quiet message, a boundary. Jaden froze. His smile flickered. He looked to Matteo, then back at the guard. Ryle's gaze didn't follow him. But in that moment, Jaden felt watched, not by the man in front of him, but by something behind the uniform, by legacy, by discipline, by a kind of strength that didn't need to strike back. Security didn't rush in. No one tackled Jaden, no dramatic takedown. Instead, the weight of silence pressed down like a second atmosphere, and it was heavier than any punch. He backed away slowly, nodding like he was still in control, but his eyes betrayed him. The crowd didn't laugh. They didn't cheer. They simply watched. A few older veterans in the back row shook their heads quietly. One child whispered, He didn't even blink. And for the first time in Jaden Locke's carefully choreographed career, he had nothing to say. For the next 11 seconds, Sergeant Owen Ryle didn't move at all. Not his boots, not his eyes, not his breath. Jaden Locke had retreated 2 full steps, suddenly unsure of himself, trying to smirk like it had all been part of the act. But no one was laughing, not anymore. Behind the gates, the crowd had changed. What had started as amusement was now uncertainty, respect, even discomfort. They were used to seeing guards mocked, toyed with, filmed. But this was something else. That sound, the impact of a real kick, still echoed in their ears like a dropped microphone in a silent room. One of the security stewards near the fence took a step forward, hand on his radio, ready to intervene. But Ryle's subtle boot shift had sent its message. Stand down. I have this. Jaden's friends lowered their cameras. Mateo, who had filmed Jaden's stunts across 4 countries, suddenly didn't like what he was capturing. He kept glancing at the display, then at Ryle. Did he just not feel that? One of them whispered. But it wasn't about pain. Ryle had felt it. The kick had connected. The impact was real. But so was the training. And more than that, the code. Years ago, in Helmand Province, Ryle had once stood for 47 minutes behind the twisted frame of a Husky vehicle after a roadside bomb went off. He was the only one left upright. Radio jammed, no air support, no backup in sight. He stood. Because one movement, one visible sign of the panic, might have exposed the location of the injured men crawling behind him. So, he didn't move. Not then, not now. Ceremonial stillness wasn't just for tourists. It was muscle memory, trauma, training, principle, and it ran deeper than skin. Across the square, a few older onlookers began to clap. Not loud, not performative, just a few soft, uncertain beats of applause that grew only slightly before falling quiet again. Some of them were veterans. Some of them just understood. Jaden stood frozen for a moment longer, then lowered his head slightly, not in shame, but in something approaching awe, like he had encountered a wall that refused to be pushed over, even when logic said it should have cracked. He backed away without another word. Ryle didn't chase, didn't look, didn't need to. The Queen's Guard is not permitted to engage unless physically threatened with persistence or repeated violence. A single strike, while unlawful, wasn't enough to break protocol. But the story didn't end there. Inside the palace gates, a protocol officer approached Sergeant Ryle. She didn't speak, just gave a short nod and walked off. She knew what had happened. They all did. The square's CCTV had caught everything. So had 6 phone cameras, and Jaden's own crew. Back in the security room, footage was already being reviewed. Officers discussed whether to escalate, to involve the police, or let it settle internally. The man had kicked a member of the King's Guard. That was assault under UK law, even if the guard hadn't reacted. But Ryle didn't press charges. He wouldn't. That wasn't how he served. By sundown, Jaden's video had gone live. Mateo uploaded it before they even left London, hoping to spin the narrative in their favor. But the internet had its own judgment, and this time, it was swift. Comments flooded in. That guard stood still after being kicked. That's not weakness. That's strength you'll never understand. I served. You never forget men like that. The black belt got humbled by a red coat. Respect. The clip was reposted on military forums, veteran pages, reaction channels. Even news outlets picked it up. But the real moment wasn't the kick. It was the aftermath. That unblinking stillness. At Wellington Barracks, where the guards returned after rotation, Ryle was met not with applause, but silence. The kind of silence that says, "We saw it. We understood." A junior guardsman passed him in the corridor and muttered, "He kicked a stone and thought it would break." Ryle said nothing. Later that evening, the commanding officer called him in, not for reprimand, but acknowledgement. "We don't issue medals for standing still, Sergeant," the officer said, folding his hands. "But if we did—" Ryle shook his head. "I was on duty, sir, nothing more." The officer nodded. He understood. Outside the barracks, a woman with a stroller stopped him as he exited onto Birdcage Walk. She had a toddler in one arm and a folded newspaper in the other. "Were you the one?" she asked gently. "In the video?" Ryle looked at her, didn't answer, just nodded slightly once. She didn't say thank you, didn't gush, just smiled. He's going to remember that. The toddler looked up at the tall man in the red tunic. He waved. Ryle didn't wave back, but his eyes moved, just a fraction. And in that moment, it was enough. Because sometimes, the most powerful reaction is no reaction at all. Jade and Locke sat in a folding chair inside the small security annex just off the palace perimeter. No cameras, no audience, just the cold hum of a ceiling vent and a female security officer reviewing footage on a mounted screen. He looked smaller now, hoodie damp with sweat, arms folded tight. His left knee bounced with nervous energy. The footage played again, silent this time. The kick, the recoil, the motionless guard. The officer didn't speak right away. She just let it loop once more before turning to him. "You understand what this could have been, Mr. Locke?" Jaden didn't answer. "Assault on active duty military, on government grounds. This isn't a TikTok prank." He swallowed. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't hard. It was just contact," she cut in. "You made deliberate physical contact with a serving soldier. That's the only part that matters." Outside, the noise of traffic passed faintly. Distant cheers floated from tourists still gathering near the square. Jaden didn't get arrested. He didn't get publicly shamed. Instead, he was handed a formal notice, banned indefinitely from approaching ceremonial military zones across the UK. His passport details flagged for re-entry surveillance. A quiet but firm message. You don't play games with men who don't move. And for once, Jaden didn't argue. He left London 2 days later. No vlog, no goodbye video. But his clip, "I kicked a royal guard and he didn't even blink," lived on. It had been edited carefully, framed like a test of discipline. But commenters saw through it. They always do. And in the sea of viral reactions, something happened that Jaden hadn't planned. People stopped talking about him. They started talking about the guard. Memes circulated, not mocking the guard's stillness, but celebrating it. Soldiers from different nations stitched responses, applauding his discipline. Civilians started tagging the palace, asking for his name. Some artists even sketched illustrations of the moment, Ryle standing stoic, with chaos swirling around him. But Ryle remained invisible to it all. Back at Wellington Barracks, the guard room was unusually quiet. Young guards whispered about him now, not just in respect, but in reverence. He didn't even shift his weight. I heard he served in Helmand, twice. Reckon he even felt the kick? They speculated, as soldiers do, filling in blanks with fragments of myth. Ryle never corrected them. He spent most of the next morning in the polishing bay, preparing his kit in silence. That's where his commanding officer found him again, this time holding an envelope. "You've received a commendation from the colonel of the regiment," the officer said. "They're offering a closed-door medal, no press, just recognition." Ryle looked up briefly, hands still methodically working over the brass on his scabbard. "No, sir." The officer raised a brow. "No?" "I stood still," Ryle replied simply. "That's what I was posted to do." A long pause. Then the officer nodded once. "Understood." Ryle didn't need a medal. He didn't need applause, because the right people had seen. And that was enough. Later that afternoon, as he sat alone on the barrack steps during a brief break, Ryle finally unfolded the letter he always carried, the one from Oliver. It was already creased from months of wear. The ink faded slightly. He read it again. Every word. Slowly. And for the first time since the video had gone viral, he noticed something. At the very bottom of the letter, just beneath his son's name, Oliver had added a line. He must have written it after sealing the main message, then opened it again and scribbled this final thought. "When I was little, I used to think you were a statue. Now I know you were a shield." Ryle stared at that line for a long time. Then, with steady fingers, he folded the paper once more and placed it back inside his breast pocket, right over the spot where the kick had landed. The silence around him felt heavier now, but not burdensome, more like earned. That evening, as crowds gathered again at Buckingham Palace for the usual changeover, the chatter had shifted. There was no laughter near the guard lines, no staged photos mocking their posture. Instead, parents pointed quietly. Children watched with curious stillness. A few teenagers who recognized Ryle didn't shout at him. They just observed. Word had spread. Even without a name, they knew who he was. The guard who didn't move. the man who made the world pause with silence. And for once, silence was enough. It was 2 days after the incident when Sergeant Owen Ryle found himself walking through the side gardens of Wellington Barracks, alone, off-duty, dressed in simple black slacks and a buttoned shirt, his shoulders still squared like armor. The city noise softened out here. No fanfare, no cameras. Just the clipped hedges and gravel path crunching softly under his boots. In his breast pocket, now stitched from a tear no one else had noticed, was the letter. The same one his son had sent him months ago. But today, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he felt ready to read it again. As if something about the way the world had paused earlier in the week made the words matter more. He sat down on a wooden bench beneath a linden tree, the same bench he used to take lunch on before his knees started giving him trouble, and with careful fingers, he unfolded the letter. Not rushed, not distracted, just present. "Dad," it began, "I don't always get why you do this." He read it slowly, each word landing like a footstep in snow. Then he reached the line he hadn't noticed before, the one written in haste, just beneath the fold, barely visible in fading ink. "When I was little, I used to think you were a statue. Now I know you were a shield." Ryle didn't cry, but something inside him shifted. He folded the letter back into thirds and held it between both palms for a moment, pressing it against the center of his chest, right over the bruise no one could see. Not the one from the kick, the deeper one, the one you carry when your own child finally sees who you are. Later that evening, back at Buckingham Palace, Ryle resumed his post under the archway. Same uniform, same boots, same stillness. But the crowd was different now. They weren't jeering, they weren't mocking, they weren't performing for their phones. They were watching, really watching, and not just him, but what he stood for. Near the fence, a father knelt beside his young daughter and whispered something to her. She looked up at Ryle with wide eyes, then lifted one small hand and gave a quiet wave. Ryle didn't move, but his eyes, just briefly, shifted to meet hers. And that alone was enough to make the father's breath hitch. Behind him, someone murmured, "That's him." A pause, then someone else. The one from the video. But no one shouted, no one rushed forward. It was as if even the tourists had absorbed the gravity of what had happened. Even silence had a reputation now. Ryle stood, rifle angled perfectly across his chest, chin lifted in the way only discipline teaches, still as the stone beneath him. And in that moment, he felt the weight of his son's words again. Not just statue, not just soldier, shield, not for glory, not for applause, but because some things must not move, no matter what kicks against them. A week passed. The story had settled. The headlines faded. Jaden Locke's name slipped from trending lists and became just another viral footnote. But Sergeant Owen Ryle kept standing, post after post, day after day. Rain, wind, the cold snap that rolled through London in early spring. None of it changed his routine. None of it asked him for anything new, except the way people looked at him. It wasn't the stares that were different. It was the silence. Tourists still came, hundreds a day, families, school groups, couples from half the world away. But now, as they passed through the gates near the Northern Arch, there was a strange reverence in the air, a kind of awareness. They didn't shout, they didn't try to provoke. Even the teenagers, who once gleefully tried to get a reaction for laughs, stood quietly now, phones lowered. They weren't sure which one he was. They didn't know the name, but they felt it. And then, one afternoon, the stillness deepened. A school group approached, a dozen or so children in green uniforms, chaperoned by 2 teachers and a staff assistant carrying snacks in a plastic tote. They clustered near the fence, peeking through, pointing politely. Not one of them yelled. Then a boy, no older than 10, tugged his teacher's sleeve. "Miss, is that him?" he whispered. "Who?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "The guard from the video," the boy said. "The one who didn't move." The teacher glanced toward the red-coated figure under the arch. She didn't know for sure. No one did, but something about the way he stood, the posture, the gravity, made her certain. She nodded slowly. "I think so." The boy watched in silence for a moment, then stepped forward and gave the smallest, most careful salute he could manage, awkward and sweet. Ryle didn't return it. He couldn't. But his eyes shifted, just slightly. A flicker of acknowledgement, and the boy smiled. As the group moved along, they didn't chatter like before. They walked quietly, glancing back a few times, as if they'd just left a church or a memorial, not a photo op. And in that stillness, something had changed. Ryle stood there, unchanged in body, but transformed in meaning. He had become a reminder that not all strength roars, that not every reaction needs to be visible, that sometimes holding your ground is the loudest thing you can do in a world full of noise. And somewhere, far from the palace gates, a university student sat in a dorm room watching that same video for the 100th time, still unsure how his father had done it, but finally understanding why. Because a real shield doesn't fight, it absorbs, it endures, and it never ever moves just because someone tells it to. Would you have stood still? Would you have reacted, flinched, spoke up? Or could you have done what Sergeant Owen Ryle did, say everything without a single word? Let us know in the comments. We read every one. And if this story gave you even a moment of pause, if it made you look at ceremonial guards in a new light, hit that like button, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss our next upload. And share this video with someone who still thinks royal guards are just props in funny hats. Because silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is the shield. Our other stories should be on your screen now. Go watch those next. And we'll see you tomorrow.